Hey everyone, welcome to Richard's Retro. This is the Bible in 2022. No announcements this week. We'll be meeting at my house. We're meeting in person this week, starting at 7:30. There's also a link in the description if you'd like to join us virtually. But if you're in town, I highly recommend showing up. I think we're going to have banana bread tonight, so it's going to be tasty. Okay, let's get into it. This week we finished Deuteronomy. We saw a listing of the consequences for obedience and disobedience. God, through Moses, as a prophet, kind of tells the Israelites exactly what they're going to do wrong and the consequences for it, but also lays out the consequences or the blessings for obedience when they return. They're given instructions to take those and actually pronounce those blessings and curses on two mountains in Canaan when they take over the land, and then when we get to Joshua, we actually see him fulfill that. We see a verse in Deuteronomy 28:67 I liked. It said, "In the morning you will say, if only it were evening, and in the evening, if only it were morning." And I thought that was, I need to be careful not to do that. It's not quite the same thing, but I'm always joking that I'm always tired in the morning and then awake at night, and I wish it was the opposite. But here, I mean, they're just wishing for the days to go by because they're in such distress. And it says in verse 63, just before that, "Just as it pleased the Lord to make you prosper and increase in number, so it will please him to ruin and destroy you." So I mean, God wants to do what is just, and he has mercy and grace, but he's not afraid to punish Israel and his children when they need discipline. I thought this was cool in chapter 29 of Deuteronomy, verse 5. "Yet the Lord says, during the 40 years I led you through the wilderness, your clothes did not wear out, nor did the sandals on your feet." And it just shows the provision that he had, even in that punishment, right? I mean, I can't wear shoes for more than a year or two without needing another pair. And these guys went 40 years without their sandals wearing out. So it's pretty, in the harsh climate. So it's pretty interesting to see him taking care of the little things that they don't even notice. Okay, we see an offer of life or death in chapter 30, verse 11. Now what I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you, or beyond your reach," similar to Corinthians. "It is not up in heaven, so you will have to ask, who will ascend into heaven to get it, and proclaim it to us, so we may obey it? Nor is it beyond the sea, so that you have to ask, who will cross the sea to get it, and proclaim it to us, so we may obey it? No, the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so you may obey it." And I see, God's plan already coming into fruition as he starts to put his word into their heart here before moving his spirit into our hearts. Okay. And we see Joshua succeed Moses. And this was interesting to me. One of the laws that Moses gives is that every 7 years they're supposed to read the law out loud to everyone. Which means for some people, the ones that were illiterate and didn't have the law, and I guess on Sabbath that's what they did, is they read the law, but it's plausible there were people that were going 7 years. Every 7 years they were getting the law, and that's it. And I read it, we're reading it every year now. And even that seems like it's not quite enough to get it to stick in my head. So I understand why they struggled. And then at the very end here we see Moses give a song where again he basically predicts the future. But we see it says chapter 32, verse 39, "See now that I myself am he. There is no God besides me. I put to death and I bring to life. I have wounded and I will heal. And no one can deliver out of my hand." And I love seeing, God call himself as the healer. And declare his sovereignty here over life and death. We see Moses bless the tribes and then die on a mountain very similar to Aaron. And no one knows where he's buried, which is good because I'm sure there would have been all sorts of shrines and worship of Moses instead of God, and so I understand why God buried him in the mountains. All right, we see Joshua lead the nations, take over Jericho. We see Rahab hide the Israeli spies, and she says, "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in the country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water at the Red Sea." It was 40 years ago. They'd heard about it. And then what you did to Shion and Og, and so, that's more recent. But it's working, right? God's plan of making a name for himself has worked. And despite these people being bigger and scarier than them, they're terrified of the Israelites, rightfully so. But it's interesting to see that this woman, Rahab, recognizes God's sovereignty and power over the situation and is willing to pick the right side. They cross the Jordan. I thought this was interesting. So as they cross, God stops the water, and it's like a mini Moses event for Joshua, and I thought that was kind of cool. It's like, oh, Joshua, you're like a mini Moses. We see them circumcise themselves at Gilgal, which, if you think about it, like for these 40 years, none of them have been following that part of the covenant and being circumcised, which now makes more sense why Moses was so, talking about circumcision of the heart. And, they call for that too. But here they're consecrating themselves physically and saying, hey, we are God's people. And I think that's important here for them. We see them take over Jericho by just marching around the city, blowing trumpets on the seventh day. And then Achan takes some of the plunder for himself, and it causes a curse on them, and so they lose their next battle. And then God reveals that, Achan took stuff, and so he and his whole family are put to death. It says, then Joshua, this is chapter 7, verse 24, then Joshua together with all Israel took Achan, son of Zerah, the silver, the robe, the gold bar, his sons and daughters, his cattle, donkeys, and sheep, his tent, and all that he had, to the valley of Acre. And Joshua said, why have you brought this trouble on us? The Lord will bring trouble on you today. And they stoned him, and everything he owned, and all the stuff that he'd taken, and I think they burn it too. Yep, and then they burn it. So again, his sin, his greed, and his lack of obedience did not just affect him; it affected his whole family. And that's the consequence of sin. Like, it really does affect everyone, and it's unfortunate because you can say they were innocent, but they were in sin. They were caught up in his sin. In chapter 9, we see the Gibeonites deceive the Israelites by saying that they were from a far land, so they make a treaty with them. And the important part here is chapter 9, verse 14. The Israelites sampled their provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord. Right? They didn't ask God what they should do. They're just like, oh, this seems okay. Right? More treaties, great. And God works it out, although, we see the Gibeonites later have a few issues. But even if something seems right, there's no reason not to bring the little things to God, right? Because it may be part of his plan. We see him take over the northern kings. And we see Joshua kind of fulfill all the laws that Moses and decrees Moses had put in place. We see the list of all the kings that Joshua took over, 31 kings in all. And then they start to divide the promised land. All right, moving on over to Psalms. We read Psalm 13 and 14 this week. So 13, I thought it was interesting, right? Actually, all of the Psalms this week are David like calling out to God, like, where are you? Like, how long will you forget me? How are you going to hide from me? But then 13 ends with verse 6. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. So even in this time where he feels lost and alone and empty, he recognizes God's goodness on his life. And I wish I had that resolve in suffering. And then in 14, verse 3, it says, all have turned away, all have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. And we know this, right, from Romans as well. But it's interesting to see David recognize it. That, despite everyone trying to be righteous, or a large number of people trying to be righteous, everyone is corrupt. No one can do this on their own. And then he hopes that salvation comes out of Zion, and it does in Jesus, but not for a while. And then we read 143, which is again another one where he's just like, where are you? But again, in verse 10, so 143, verse 10, teach me to do your will, for you are my God. May your good spirit lead me on level ground. So again, in all this, he's asking for direction, and he doesn't reject God in this situation. He says, you're mine, teach me to do your will. So, in all this, I'm being pursued by enemies. I feel like you're not there. You're hiding your face, but you're my God. Teach me. And that should be our heart and our desire. All right, moving over to Luke 12. We got a lot of Jesus this week. It was very good. We see Jesus speak against hypocrisy. We see the parable of the rich fool. And Jesus says in chapter 12, verse 14, or verse 15 rather, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. And I think all too often many of us fall into this trap of thinking, oh, we got to get more, we got to provide for our families, provide for our kids, provide for our church. But that's not what life is about. It's not about possessing things. It's not about finishing things. It's about community, interacting with people, interacting with God. And we put those on the back burner, like, oh, well, once I have enough stuff, I can do that. And that's life. Like, don't miss that. We see one of my favorite verses in verse 25. Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? And then a very common one in verse 34. Still, this is all chapter 12. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Just reminding us to store our treasure up in heaven. And then this is interesting. Jesus is calling the people to repent, and he tells a parable of a fig tree. I'll read it. It's very short. A man had a fig tree growing in his vineyard, and he went to look for fruit, but did not find any. So he said to the man who took care of the vineyard, for 3 years now I've been coming back for fruit on this fig tree and haven't found any. Cut it down. Why should it use up the soil? And then he says, sir, the man replied, leave it alone for 1 more year. I'll dig around it and fertilize it. If it bears fruit next year, fine. If not, then cut it down. So we see grace in this parable. But we still see that trees need to bear fruit. But in this instance, we've been talking about this a lot, that the cool thing about the tree metaphor is that we don't do anything, right? Like, I mean, the tree doesn't try and bear fruit. It just does. It's part of its healthy life cycle. But something that we haven't talked about in that metaphor is that it uses nutrients to do that, right? When you bear fruit, it's pulling those nutrients out of the soil. It's consuming something. Now, it should be consuming God, who's infinite. But I'm just curious what you think the soil is in this parable, right? Or in any of the references to us being bearers of fruit. What is our soil? We see Jesus heal on the Sabbath, and the multiple times and the Pharisees get upset, and him correct them, saying, like, who wouldn't help their kid if they were sick on the Sabbath? Like, why can't we heal on the Sabbath? And they've got no good answer. We see the parable of the lost son, which is just awesome. I love, when he comes back, it says, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. And again, if you don't know, I mean, this parable is Jesus talking to us about how God views us, right? He wants us to come back to him, and runs towards us when we decide. Going along with the greed verse from earlier in chapter 16, verse 13, it says, you cannot serve both God and money, and just more parables about getting your priorities straight, putting your interest in God rather than in money. And in this one, in not, valuing things of this earth, but valuing things that are eternal. And then it says in verse 15, what people value highly is detestable in God's sight. And I wonder if that's a blanket statement or if he's just talking about greed and wealth here. Or if all the things that we put value on, God's like, ugh, can't believe you put value there. We see the parable about the rich man and the beggar with Lazarus. And I thought this was interesting because, well, actually, it doesn't say this is a parable. So this could be real. And we see, I thought this was interesting, in verse 22, the time came when the beggar died and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. We've been talking about angels a bunch recently. And I just saw this as cool because we see them as messengers, we see them as warriors, but here we see them as wayfarers of souls and spirits after they're dead. And it's just I've always known that, but it's just another thing we can add to our list as we kind of think about their purpose. But we see Lazarus ask if the beggar can tip of his finger in water to cool his tongue. So I guess we do have tongues in our permanent bodies, although I don't know if they have permanent bodies yet in this. But he does have a tongue. But I thought it was interesting that that's what he wanted, right? He's hot. He's being consumed by fire. But what he wants is his tongue to be cold. And I thought that was interesting. I mean, it's probably an expression, but it stood out to me. So I'm curious what you think. And we see at the very end in chapter 16, verse 31, he said to them, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. And this is obviously pointing to Jesus rising from the dead and them not listening to him either. Okay, it was a great reading this week. Hope you enjoyed it. And check out some of the verses I mentioned if you missed them. And we'll talk about your questions tonight at 7:30. Can't wait to see you. Cheers.